Greetings and salutations, and thank you for clicking on the video. This video is either going to be a fun little romp into the world of the spoken word, or it's going to be the beginning of a flame war, and it all depends on your point of view. One of the interesting things about the Linux community is the fact that there is a constant wrangle going on about how things should be pronounced. And when I started posting YouTube videos about Linux, it started almost immediately. You said this wrong, you said that wrong, this is the pronunciation that you should say, and it goes on and on. I'm used to this because I spent a good deal of my life working in radio and television. And this is something that you just get used to when you are putting yourself out there for other people to hear. Many people have different opinions about how words should be said or how things should be phrased, and believe me, they have no problem whatsoever telling you. And I could tell a bunch of radio-related stories, and I'll just tell you a couple of them that have to do with that before we jump into getting into this. Some of you might appreciate this. When I first started learning about broadcasting, I was going to school in Chesapeake, Virginia. They have a radio station out there at the Center for Science and Technology, which is a vocational center run by the school system. And one of the unique things about this particular radio station was it actually had some power behind it. It was a full-time radio station. Most school radio stations that you think of are very low power. This one actually served the entire city. And the city of Chesapeake has a large geographic area, and so we had an audience that was around 1 million people. So it was a real radio station, and it wasn't just the students that ran the radio station. There was actually a staff of announcers that ran the radio station when the kids weren't in school or somebody wasn't, a student wasn't available. And the format of this radio station was mainly classical music with some jazz and big band and a few other program oddities thrown in on the weekends. And there was one fellow there who was a staff announcer. His name was William Verinder, and he had worked for the BBC. And William spoke in very proper English, probably from his BBC training, and I can still remember him looking at me and saying, "That is pronounced Rafe von Williams, not Ralph von Williams. If you are going to announce a piece by Rafe von Williams, you must say his name correctly." So this is where it started, learning how to say all of those foreign names that go along with the classical music world. A few years later, I was working at a radio station that was actually way out in the country in the western part of the state. And I remember having a discussion with the program director, general manager, owner, all the same person, about pronouncing the word salmon, which is a fish. In that area of the world, the accepted pronunciation was salmon. In other words, you actually said the L in salmon. And that is incorrect, of course. And I remember looking at him and saying, "I'm sorry, I don't care what any of these idiots around here say. I am not going to go on the radio and call it salmon. It is salmon." So this is something that I'm quite used to. And I get a giggly kick out of it, to tell you the truth. Anyway, let's start talking a bit about Linux. The first word that we have to discuss is Linux itself, because my very first introduction to Linux was around 1998 when I went to work for Gateway Computer. And I was working with a fellow at a radio station at that time named Mike Williams. And Mike was a great web designer, and I remember asking him one day about Linux. And he looked at me, and the first thing that came out of his mouth was, "Oh, you mean Linux?" And you still hear people every now and again say that. They will say Linux. Now, we've pretty much gotten rid of that in the community. There is a movie that was made in the early 2000s called Revolution OS, in which there is an interview with Linus Torvalds, who is the fellow who created the Linux kernel. And in that movie, he says, depending on what language I'm speaking, my name is pronounced differently. So it's either Linus in English or Linus, and a lot of people call him Linus. And he's totally fine with that. But he said that Linux is always Linux no matter what. The name Linux is a combination of the name Linus or Linus, and the Ux comes from Unix because he was trying to come up with a system that worked and acted a lot like Unix. Actually, the system that he was modeling Linux on when he created it was Minix, which is a form of Unix that was designed to run mini computers. So that's where that name came from. So the correct pronunciation of that is Linux. The next one I want to talk about is Ubuntu. This one is mispronounced all over the place. I've heard it said Ubuntu. I used to say it when I first started learning about it, Ubuntu. The close to correct pronunciation here is Ubuntu. And my reference for this is Mark Shuttleworth, who is the founder of the Ubuntu project. If you ever hear him give a speech, he calls it Ubuntu. It's an African word that means community, and it's pronounced Ubuntu. Here's one that kind of gets on my nerves. I usually just let these things slide because I really don't care. It's all regional pronunciation anyway. It's like in England, they say schedule. In America, we say schedule. In America, we say controversy. In England, they say controversy. So you could chalk a lot of these up to just regional dialects. But this one kind of gets on my nerves. People who call GNOME GNOME. And there are some pretty heavyweight commentators who post YouTube videos and do podcasts and things like that in the Linux community who call it GNOME. It is pronounced GNOME. And I reference that to the GNOME project itself. If you go to the GNOME project page and you look at any of their videos, they all call it GNOME. Therefore, I call it GNOME. So you can continue to call it GNOME if you want to, but it's GNOME. Of course, this one is the hottest topic of debate lately because here on this channel, I have talked mainly about Ubuntu Mate, which is an awesome distribution of Linux, and you really ought to give it a try. The spelling of Mate, or Mate, is M-A-T-E, which looks like mate, as in roommate or checkmate. But the actual name of the desktop comes from a South American flower. The folks who started the Mate project are from South America, and right now I'm blanking out. I can't remember whether it's Brazil or Chile, so forgive me on that one. But they named it after a local flower, which is a Mate. So really, that should have one of those little squigglies above the E like you would see in the French word café. And it's just one of those weirdnesses. So the correct pronunciation there is mate or mate. I tend to lean more toward mate because it took me a long time not to see that word and say mate. So I had to put a little emphasis on it, but it's actually mate. I say mate, but mate is what it's supposed to be. Here's another one that I just found out that I have been pronouncing wrong, and I will probably continue to pronounce it wrong. Kaja, which is the file manager in the Mate desktop, is actually pronounced Caja, because the J, as in the Spanish language, has a sound like an H. But I've heard it called Kaja most of the time, and I just recently heard somebody say something about that. So, some of you may be wondering, if the Mate desktop is based on GNOME 2, why do we have all these different names? In the open source world, if you want to take a project and you want to fork it and you want to make it your own, that's perfectly all right. The GNU General Public License allows you to do that. One of the stipulations, though, is you have to rename it. You have to rename all the parts of the project. So the developers, when they forked GNOME 2, when the GNOME project moved on to GNOME 3, had to go through every component and give it a different name. Okay? The next one is Sudo. Somebody just corrected me on this not too long ago, and I kind of go back and forth on my pronunciation of Sudo. The command actually means super user do, or switch user do. I've heard it described both ways. So the quote-unquote correct pronunciation is Sudo. However, when you look at it, it looks like sudo. And a lot of people in the Linux community say sudo. So I've kind of gravitated toward that particular pronunciation. The next one we want to talk about is probably the oldest raging debate in the Linux community about how to pronounce the name of a program, and that is VI, or Vi. For those of you who are new to Linux, Vi is a text editor. It's really, really old. It comes from Unix. It's been around for a long, long time, and it is extremely counterintuitive. In other words, if you're used to using a word processor like Microsoft Word or WordPerfect or any of those things that you may have learned on, sitting down in front of a terminal and learning how to use Vi or VI is a real pain, because you have to kind of read the book before you do anything. You have to know the commands. But there are those out there who really, really, really like it, and it's very, very lightweight. And so there's like a cult following for Vi. These days there's an M on the end of it because it's, I really don't know what the M stands for, but it's Vim improved, I've heard it called. So anyway, it's either VI or it's Vi, and if you say that in certain company, you may get a sock in the mouth, depending on which way you say it, because you never know. That's a raging debate that's gone on for a long time. Here's one that I've heard mispronounced a couple of times, and I don't really know which one is right or wrong, and that is Manjaro. I've also heard it called Manjaro or Manjaro or Manjaro. Most people call it Manjaro, and I throw it in there just because there it is. Whether it's Manjaro or Manjaro or Manjaro, I'm not really sure. Maybe somebody in the project might want to put a comment down here and correct me as well, so I can be 100% sure, but I hear it pronounced Manjaro. And the last one that I want to talk about is actually one of the reasons I'm doing this video, and that is Xenial. When I did the video about a sneak peek of Ubuntu 16.04, which has become a wildly popular video on my channel for whatever reason, I made a joke at the beginning about the correct pronunciation of Xenial, and I pronounced it as Xenial. I looked it up, and the pronunciation guide that I was looking at, that's the way they pronounced it, like Xenial or Xenial. But it's Xenial, as in Xenial xeris. A xeris being a ground squirrel that lives in Africa. So there you go, Xenial. It's Xenial xeris. And that's about all I've got on the list, but there's more in there. I think the main point of this video that I wanted to get across was that there is far too much energy that is expended in the Linux world about the way people say the name of the project. The truth of the matter is, it really doesn't matter what people call it, because people are going to call it different things in different parts of the world anyway. What's more important is that people use it. So when you hear these, I mean, people waste time, man. They write paragraphs about how you should pronounce things. It's like, wait a minute, hold on. Does it really matter what they call it? I mean, really. But I figured I would say something about it anyway, because I just kind of get a kick out of it. I get all of these different comments all the time where people are correcting me on my pronunciations, and I usually do not respond in any way because it's like I'm used to it. When I worked in broadcasting, there wasn't a day that went by that the phone didn't ring and somebody said, "You said that wrong, you phrased that wrong, you got that wrong." And anytime that you put something out there for public consumption, it's going to get that sort of critique. It's just what people do. But I usually refrain from critiquing other people in the Linux community who post videos because I don't particularly appreciate non-productive critiques, and I certainly don't want to be categorized in that list of trolls who go out there and just pick everything apart. But anyway, if you're interested in pronunciations, if you are one of those people that aspire to broadcast or public speak or something like that, there is a book that I want to tell you about, and I was looking for a screenshot of it, but there really isn't anything on the cover but the name anyway. And it was published in 1967, and it was written by a fellow named Hal Fisher. It's called The Man Behind the Mic, and he spells Mike M-I-K-E, like the name. And in that book, he talks a great deal about correct pronunciation, and there are all kinds of vocal exercises and things that you can do. This is a book that was a textbook for me when I was in school and when I was taking radio class, and it's really very interesting. He has lists of words with the correct pronunciations, like hundreds of them in that book that you can look up and practice and play with. A lot of the technical information doesn't really apply to radio and television today. That book's it's 50 years old at this point. But the talk about how to pronounce things and how to speak and how to breathe properly and all that stuff is very useful. I don't pay a lot of attention to that because I have always wanted to have more of a conversational style when I was on the radio or TV. But you really have to kind of pay attention to a little bit of that. I mean, if I have to do it, I can speak very properly indeed. And when I used to do newscasts on the radio, this is how you do it, with a right in the middle of your vocal register, and you read carefully, you know. A dog exploded on the corner this morning, and 60 fleas lost their lives in the explosion. News at 11, But for my on-air style, I've always just tried to be as regular and I want to sound like a person on the radio and not a radio person. So how much of that I actually absorbed, I don't really know. But anyway, thank you for watching the video, gang. Be sure and check out Easy Linux on the web. Be sure and check out Easy Linux on Facebook. And if you do, give it a like. Oh, there's my ride. Gotta go. And do check out freedompenguin.com as well for some pretty cool articles that are coming up in the not too distant future from me and other contributors. So thank you once again for watching the video, and this time around the very end of the video is not going to be chopped off because I have switched back to Simple Screen Recorder, which is now available for Ubuntu 16.04.